Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first December talk. And our speaker today is Valentina Colonna, who's going to tell us about the project titled Phonetics for the Poetic Voice, the European Project Voices of Spanish Poets. And I'm super excited because Valentina has a very interesting profile in terms of the disciplines involved. Uh, Valentina is a piano composer, a poet, a pianist, a researcher. I would also say a phonetician, based on your profile. So that's for me, that's a very interesting combination, and not one that we often get. So I'm happy you are here. And Valentina is interested in poetry and music and the music of poetry. And you've also worked with the Experimental Phonetics Laboratory at the University of Turin. And you also worked on a project focusing on Italian poets as well. Right now, you are in Spain at the University of Granada, where you are working on the project that you will tell us about. Yes. And Valentina published poetry in Italy, Austria, Germany, and Spain in Italian, German, and possibly other languages. And the last thing I'll say is that Valentina has holds different degrees, which are quite interdisciplinary. So one in ancient literature, another one in linguistics, and then another one in digital humanities. So this should be a nice, a super interdisciplinary talk. So please, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Misha, for your kind presentation and also for the opportunity to be here with you and sharing my study, sharing my research field and my interest in poetry. I would share the screen if you agree, my presentation. Okay. Okay. I should try to present. Oh, okay. Is it okay?
We see it as we should. Yes.
Okay. So thank you again, Misha. My presentation is about the phonetic study of poetry recording and the possible applications of phonetics to poetic voice. And I will introduce the project of Voices of Spanish Poets. That's my project here at the University of Granada. Before presenting and before starting telling you about the project, I would like to introduce the origins of this kind of study that find its roots that dates back to the beginning of the last century in Paris. In fact, we can find at the beginning of the last century in the laboratory of phonetics, where phoneticians like Rousselot and Bruno worked, the first recordings of poetry. So phonetics and poetry are connected from since the beginning, because phoneticians worked also on poetry recordings, working to their conservation, and also try also to explore these materials. Few years later, because this happened in the 1913 in Paris. Well, some years later in Spain, another phonetician like Tomás Navarro Tomás, and that was also a scholar specialized in metrics, did something similar because he worked on preservation of famous voices and also explored the voice of poetry, the voice of poets, through a phonetical method. So it provided some descriptions, some of the first descriptions of poetry recordings. If we continue looking at the last century, explorations of the field, we can find Roman Jakobson, that also was interested in this research, in this research field, recognizing that it was very significant, and it provided also some of the first descriptions of poetry read aloud. However, it's only from the 70s onwards that we can also find notable phonetic findings, experimental phonetic findings, that grow over time. And we can find also a connection between the phonetic study and the conservation of the materials, the conservation through vocal archives, because it has been necessary to allow the study, the phonetic study. When we start considering this special research field that's not so explored, well, we can have many questions. For example, why study the voice of poets, and how many challenges are involved? Because of course it's a challenging kind of speech that has not been not considered for a long time, and also maybe we can also wonder if there's an evolution a long time that can be identified, and if something very specific at a methodological aspect, methodological level, can be employed. So it's a very special speech because it's an artistic and read speech, and we can try to answer this question with some points. For example, we work on or not oral poetry, but vocal poetry in a certain way, in a written poetry that's read aloud. So it's different, and we are also we consider also a special performance that's connected to the written text. At the same time, this kind of study provides also new perspectives on text, so on poetry, as well as on phonetics, and of course requires specific methodology and approaches that are interdisciplinary. As a last point of this first answer to the previous questions, I want to mention that, of course, interlinguistic and diachronical studies offer a global intersectoral overview that can grow over time and provide information that have not been explored before. I'll start presenting the project, the Voices of a Spanish Poets project that Vocal Archive, an experimental study on poetry reading. It's a project funded by the European Union. It's a Marie Skłodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellowship project, and it's hosted at the University of Granada, at the Department of General Linguistics and Literary Theory, and the Research Center for Mind, Brain, and Behavior. And this project has been possible thanks to the previous experience of Voices of Italian Poets. That has been, as Misha mentioned before, my PhD project that's continuing now in Italy, and it's the project that has been the first vocal archive of poetry voices, of contemporary poetry voices in Italy, and the first history of Italian poetry reading based on phonetic analysis. At the moment, we have more than 1,000 recordings. We have a comparative and level, and also a qualitative level of data collection. So we have many recordings of the same text, and many recordings of the text by an author, read by the author the own author, and it has been the project that allowed us also to see how poetry recordings are able to provide information, and very useful information for phonetics and also for literature studies. We detected some crucial features of poetry reading that has been necessary for a qualitative description, and also to start defining a diachronical analysis. And we defined, for example, we found that there's an organization at the prosodic level of the text, of the prosodic text, related and not always related to the written text. There's a prosodic poetic style that's featured by specific indices, specific features, and also other aspects like a rhetoric of intonation that's very interesting and based on repeated patterns, as well as a reproduction of textual rhetoric, written rhetoric that's not always like we can imagine, that can be produced. So also a comparison between the prosodic rhythm and meter and the detection of many phonetic features allowed us to define the base, the basis for a future phonetic study applied not only to Italian but also to other languages, like for example Spanish. And the Voices of Spanish Poets project, of course, aims to be a first project for the experimental study of poetry reading, and its main goal is to preserve, conserve, and valorize and explore the voices of the 20th and 21st century poets. And a phonetic methodology combined also with psycholinguistic approach are combined into a vocal archive. I will present it more in detail, and I start introducing the objectives of this project, that are first the dynamic vocal archive. The Voices of Spanish Poets vocal archive is not only a vocal archive, it's a vocal archive that also provides information, phonetic information, to offer a guide to listening poetry. So I will present it later. And the second objective was the experimental phonetic study on poetry reading, and that aimed at developing the first history of Spanish poetry reading based on phonetic analysis. The third objective was the development of a cognitive, psycholinguistic, psychophysiologic experimental study on poetry reading that I won't present in this occasion, but is an eye-tracking study based on perception and reception of poetry. And the fourth objective was the connection of all these aspects into the platform, into the archive, into the vocal archive. So to start presenting the phonetic results and the phonetic aspects of this project, I want to mention the objectives of this phonetic study. So we had three main objectives: to track the evolution of reading over time, to define possible groupings according to gender and style towards a history of Spanish poetry reading, and also as a third point, to identify common and divergent features in multiple readings of a same text. In fact, we have a selection of 8 texts by Federico Garcia Lorca, read by, for example, 50 poets, contemporary poets, that of course use a different prosody. Each poet use a specific personal prosody that changes the text. So this project started on May 2023, and at the beginning we had planned to record 300, to have 300 recordings. Actually, at the moment, we have quite 900 recordings, even if 40 of them are of the last century and not belong to the archive, for intellectual property. But we studied and we are connected to these archives, like a Library of Congress of Washington and Voz Viva de Mexico, that allow us to listen to these materials on our website and to provide our phonetic information in view of towards a history of phonetic, phonetic history of poetry reading. And all these recordings that we have done, that are recordings of original readings by the authors and readings of Lorca's poems read by the contemporary poets, has been possible thanks to many collaborations that we have and that I mentioned here in the picture. I want to start presenting you some results, some of our findings of the project, and I mentioned the data that we have already analyzed, that are only 40 recordings belonging to 15 authors of the 20th century. Here we find, of course, the gender level is not totally, of course, balanced, unfortunately, because of the century. But of course, in our archive, we are working looking at gender balance continuously. And here we find in the color, in the pink, with the pink color, for example, some names that correspond to subgroup that we defined after the analysis, because these authors present readings that are that present common features, and this allowed us to define and propose a first periodization of poetry reading a long time. In fact, thanks to our analysis, we found that we can listen to different kinds of readings, depending also on the time of that readings, on the time of corresponding to that recording. In fact, we borrowed from the Italian project the terminology of first radio television and second radio television, even if this data come from archives and not radio television archives, like it happened in Italian context, where we didn't we hadn't archives of vocal archives of Italian poetry, for example. And we found a change around the middle of the 70s. And we found that in that period, in the same period that in Italy, we found recordings that are changing. So the recordings that are before that period are similar in many aspects, and the recordings that are from the middle of the 70s to the 90s are similar in other aspects, and then I will explain it in a more detailed way. I'll introduce the methodology that I applied to this project, and that's based on the previous model of study that has been perfected and updated. So we started considering a rather like a graph that provide a qualitative description based on 20 indices. And of course, at the beginning, we had also other descriptions, for example, to look at the enjambment, production, the relationship between utterance and meter, the prosodic cause and the pause comparisons. But in this case, I will present the radar instrument, like a qualitative description, visual description of a reading that has been applied to other languages like Spanish, but also to English and French. This is the radar that we are using in this project, and find its roots in the previous one. In this case, we find that this graph includes three main sections. The organization section that includes the organization indices, a section of acoustic indices, the more traditional phonetic aspects of reading, and something that concerns the stylistic indices, so the style or the prosodic style of the reading. So starting from the right part, the organization section, here we find possibilities of or prosodic curves that we define like the interposal units that cut the verse or cut the poem into the prosodic text. So, for example, if we find here on the right a sample of a poem. It's a poem by Lorca that starts with verde, que te quiero verde, verde viento, verde ramas. So, they are two verses, and that it means green, that I love you, green, green wine, green branches. So when we read the poem, we don't usually use the same strategy of writing, and we detected, for example, that interposal units can include only portions or larger portions of full verses of the written text. For example, the verse curve corresponds to a full simple verse. For example, green, that I love you, green. So in this case, the interposal curve corresponds to the verse. But many times we also find that interposal units are very small and includes only portion of a verse. So a verse is cut into smaller units. For example, if I read green, that I love you, green. So we'll call this kind of interposal unit, like as a Yami-verse curve. And in the case of connection between the first line and the second line, we will find interverse curve. For example, if I read green, that I love you, green, green wine, so without pause in the middle, and B-verse curve or polyverse curve if we read more verses into a single interposal unit. Sorry. So this is is a style typical of, for example, of actors, not so used in poetry recordings, as I found in previous studies on comparing actors and poets and reading. And in this case, for example, I would read green, that I love you, green, green wine, green branches, so without cuts inside. And this is at the organization level, but at an acoustic level, more traditional phonetic aspect, we can find other aspects like speech rate that's calculated as a syllable per second without pauses. So we don't consider fluency rate in this case, even if in other cases we also consider fluency rate, but they rather only include speech rate. And also other aspect like change of tone change that in the register change, so that we mark this aspect where the voice setting change index and the span of the pitch during the full reading. At the left or the other, we find other indices that we defined because we needed to define specific indices, also using a terminology and also finding inspiration by musicology. For example, in fact, listening to the recordings and analyzing the many recordings, we found a typical way of repetition of intonation that we wanted to define using this index, that's synonymia and palilogia, that comes from music, from musical language, in particular from Baroque music and the rhetorics that was employed in Baroque music, and defined the repetition of a musical line of a melody like synonymia or palilogia, depending on the repetition at the same level or at a different tone level. So we defined it as like synonymia and palilogia intonation because we find a use of rhetoric in intonation. And we also define like DA, like declarative index, the index that correspond to a special intonation in poetry. That's an intonation mainly declarative, but not only a normal declarative that's marked by this index, but also a poetic declarative. I will show an example. A poetic declarative is not a normal descendant boundary, a falling boundary. It's a boundary that falls down. No, it's a boundary that that presents a medium level at the end. So it's not a very terminal boundary. It's a special one. And we also found another index, for example, the plenus here on the left, plenus that marks the ratio between the total duration of the interposal units and the total duration of pauses. So in that case, we can find also the relationship between speech and pauses, speech and silence of pauses, and other indices that I don't focus, where I don't focus now. Here I present, for example, a case of intonational palilogy. So we can listen to the example.
Cuervos nocturnos de sangrientas uñas.
You can hear. Okay, perfect. And the other case in the same reading is
Tristes cobardes de las sombras tristes.
So if we listen to this case, this is a portion from two portions from Rafael Alberti's reading. So we find very, very, very similar boundaries. So the same boundary and the same meaning of boundary that's repeated. So this is the case of rhetorical intonation, that rhetorical use of intonation. And this is the case of poetic declarative. I didn't put the audio, sorry, I can find it, but I forgot it, sorry, here, but the image can show the boundary, the final boundary that I described before. So desnuda y adherida tu desnudez, the boundary, the final boundary is not totally falling down, but it's like suspended, but it's not a suspension, a real suspension. So in this case, that's also repeated in another part of the poem by the same author, that's Carmen Conde. So we find a sample of poetic declarative. So a specific intonation in poetry that we found in the Italian corpus, and we also finding in the Spanish context. So starting from these methodologies, we also, I have to say that we work, of course, on Pratt, and we annotate with many levels. At the beginning, we used only 4 levels, a text level, and the 3 levels based on the prosodic analysis. So the 4th level here is the level only transcribing the verse, and this is compared all the time with the real prosodic level that includes at the beginning the rhythmical words level that marks the stressed, the perceived, the percepted stress units that we define rhythmical words. Then the prosodic curve that includes the interposal units, and finally the poetic utterance, that means also a wider unit that can include more prosodic cars, and that's an utterance for poetry, so a special kind of utterance. So at the beginning we had only these levels of annotation, and we started the other aspects manually or in an automatic way. But through a script that we developed in these last months with Domingo Roman Montes de Oca from Chile, a phonetician from Santiago de Chile, we also we added some levels, for example, to mark the tone of declarative and to mark the synonymias in the intonation, the number of syllables, the many aspects, and to extract all the data in an automatic way. So this script helped us to extract all the information for the radar through a more simple way, an automatic approach. So I start to speak about the first and second radio television and radio television in poetry reading, presenting some results. Here we find, for example, some of the indices I commented before, and I start commenting the speech rate. The speech rate we are that we can see here that compares the first and the second radio television presents very different values, because the mean values are very higher in the second radio televisions. That confirms an evolution in poetry reading a long time, and that that we can say that's faster in the after the 70s, and it's a value that's very similar to the same phenomenon in Italy, where we found the same phenomenon. So we found a faster reading in the second radio television, and it was something that we also supposed at the beginning of our analysis, because also comparing with radio speech and other kinds of speech is typical of the evolution of also of mediated speech to increase the speed of the speech. But at the same time, we compared also the plenus rate, the plenus index, that revealed the relationship between the total duration of prosodic cars and total duration of pauses. And we saw that the levels are very different. In particular, we can say that the use of pauses has increased a long time. Well, the duration of pauses has been is possible to be considered a little bit more wider, and it's just the opposite of the case of the Italian case, for example. So in the first radio television we could find a higher presence of speech on pauses, and the contrary in the case of the second radio television. Also, the pitch span is interesting to be checked, because we find a wider extension in the first group, even if the difference is less significant than the other two cases. Also, at a stress level, we can find that in the first radio television, for example, a way of marking the reading was to mark rhythmical words inside the inside the interposal units. And on the contrary, in the second radio television, we found a different behavior that was based on division of utterances, of poetic utterances, into prosodic curves that are not so strongly marked inside. So like a stronger mark of the of the reading in the first period. Here we find the radar applied to two authors, and for each author we consider 3 recordings. And we can find, for example, the levels of the plenus, so the relationship between the speech and the pauses, that are very different between the two authors, and also show a variety into the same author. But globally, we can find a higher level in the first author, in the first radio television author. That's on the left of the picture. And on the other side, if we compare the speech rate, we can find, for example, here the higher levels in the Carmen Conde readings. Here we compared Nesina de Champursin and Carmen Conde, that are 2 authors that have been classified like the first one belonging to the first radio television and Carmen Conde to the second radio television. At the same time, we can find that this image shows us that every author presents its own style. That's also her, in this case, her own style. That's also that depends, of course, on the text, and presents so different organization aspects, different phonetic indices, different also prosodic, different styles of prosody. But at the same time, we can find common elements in each author, and variation within the same author, depending on the poem and depending on the performance, of course. So this won't be also a sample of this variation that can be identified at more level. So in general, we find we can find in poetry speech specific features that are variable over time, but also a rich variation, but also a norm in a certain way that allowed us also to say that, to speak about an history of poetry reading. And also that we detected some parameters that help us to detect the evolution over time, and also possible comparisons with other national contexts. For example, the Italian context can give us further information for a cultural, intercultural, and interlinguistic overview that can bring us new information of speech over time, and poetry transmission, poetry communication over time. And in general, we see an evolution from declamation to naturalness. From the beginning, from the September 2024, we also published our vocal archive online. That's already a dynamic vocal archive, because it's an archive, as I said before, that includes also a phonetic perspective. In fact, there's a guide for a conscious listening that's provided by the archive, and we also presented the first results of the cognitive studies that I don't present here, but presenting the dynamic vocal archive, I want to introduce the benefits also of phonetic studies application. So this is a concrete application of our results of our study to our vocal archive. So the archive provides many levels of consultation, many levels of exploration of the archive of the voices. And among these levels, there's, for example, the last one, that's the phonetic history of reading. And here we can find the first and the second radio television, and of course the objective is also to continue providing the today's poetry reading history with all the varieties and the possible groupings. At the moment, we started with the first and second radio television because we had to select only a part of our corpus. And our dynamic archive also provides an advanced system of filtering that's based on the indices that I explained before. It's based on the phonetic analysis, and so provides information about prosodic organization, acoustic parameters, and prosodic styles. There's a typo there, but we are trying to update continuously the archive, but it requires a lot of time. So, for example, the case of this recording for Como Era by Damaso Alonso, where we can find in when we open this recording, metadata of the related to the recording, as well as phonetic description of the same recording. Here we provide an example. Here we find the general metadata, and we are arranging also to include further metadata that have been cut from the publication, but we are planning to introduce them. And we find here other levels. For example, a prosodic organization. Here we find, for example, metrical reading, syntactical reading. So here we find the levels. For example, a medium level, a high level of syntactical level, acoustic parameters, the same. So for example, speech rate, the levels are based on the whole corpus. So depending on the whole corpus, we created some thresholds that allow us to say that this reading, for example, presents a high speech rate or a low speech rate, for example. So here, if we press on the button of prosodic organization or acoustic parameter or prosodic style, we find all the indices that are described at a simple way, at a describing way. How to say? It's a simplification of the phonetic analysis to be shared. It aimed at being shared for teaching didactics applications. And here, for example, we find an application, a graph of the radar that's simplified with a reduced number of indices that are here provided for a description of the reading. This is the case, for example, of a reading coming from an archive of an external archive, that's the Library of Congress of Washington. Of course, all the data that we recorded are online and are listenable, and also it is possible to download them. Here I propose only a later part of a comparative study on a part of the archive. So on the Lorca's archive, the Lorca section archive. The Lorca section presents 8 poems read by all the poets that we recorded, quite all the poets. Here we selected 10 readers, women poets and men poets, and we we conducted a comparative study. Among the main results, one of the most interesting was the result of the tonal gap in the reading of a poem. And so these are 3 different poems with different lengths, of course, of the different number of verses per poem, and every point is a verse. So we found that the women poets in red used a higher tonal span of so a tone span that's very interesting, and shows so that also further comparative analysis can be developed, also comparing, for example, women and men performance. And here we resumed another comparative analysis that we did for the to consider the beginning of a poem, where we compared again women and men poets reading the first the beginning of a poem, and in this case we don't find a relevant difference between the women and men poets, but we find quite common behaviors in the production of the 4 kinds of prosodic cars that we described before. So, for example, verse curve, amiverse curves, interverse curves, and polyverse curves. So in this case, we found that depending also on the kind of poem, we find different organizations that are repeated among different performer, different voices reading the same text. So the behaviors are very similar. I'm concluding my presentation. So I of course, one of the objectives for our last months of the project is to continue the phonetic and cognitive study and the integration of the approaches. And the project will finish in April. And of course, I hope that it can continue because it's a project that's just start in a certain way, because it's a project that's that can continue, because the material is a lot, and this kind of research requires a lot of things to be done, that because it's quite new. So in general, we can we can say that some advantage of a phonetic study of poetry can be considered, and of course we have many challenges that we have to confront with, and we have to effort. But starting with the advantage, well, we can say that poetry reading of course presents specific key features, and this variation within an author and among authors also reveal new information about text and author. And in this perspective, that's an interdisciplinary perspective, also can provide a new perspective in teaching of poetry, and as well as in poetry listening, and in also in linguistics, because poetry can be considered a part of material for phonetic studies. And it's also like a return to the origins, because we are coming back to the origins of phonetics, where poetry wasn't excluded by phoneticians. And the acoustic study of poetry can find new applications in not only in teaching but also in research, and these research findings findings can find new applications in teaching and sharing poetry voices with poetry lovers. So, of course, we have many challenges. For example, all the international regulations for data protection and intellectual property. That's also something that we have to confront with, and also the increased interdisciplinarity can give us new can help a lot, can give us new new perspectives, and offering diverse approaches and new collaborations involving many fields that can collaborate in also providing an interlinguistic view. And of course, all these kinds of words can help raising awareness of in poetry listening. So an awareness of music, of poetry, that can be studied, can finally be studied and investigated and described. So maybe it can be it can find also applications in a new research also field, and new teaching field, like the study of poetry performance. And so anything, nothing. Sorry, I want to thank you. Thanks. I want to thank again Misha for her invitation, and all of you for your attention. Thank you.